So one of the things that I want to cover today is this idea that our ego sort of gets in the way of what we're doing, but also everybody else's ego gets in the way of what they're doing. And it's important to sort of think about this both ways around. And the way this manifests sort of in the modern world, the way we see it the most in the modern world, is this phenomena where smart people don't like simple things. And this happens to us. Like we become too smart and then we don't like simple things. And it happens to others. And you see it kind of all over the place. So if somebody wants to be smart or think they're smart, or they're in a position where they want to take over authority or dominance or be in charge, leadership, whatever, they'll prefer complicated problems and complicated formulations and complicated explanations to simple ones. And the same with solutions. They'll prefer very complicated solutions to very simple solutions because it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like you've accomplished anything if you've just discovered something somebody else has already discovered, or you're discovering something that can be summed up in 2 words. And this is very disturbing. And it happens all the time. And so that's what I'd like to talk about today. This idea that smart people or people who want to be smart don't like simple problems or solutions. Now, the reason why this is important is because this happens all the time. It's happening constantly. And I think the confusion is that it's easy to make things complicated relatively if you're smart. And so you can come up in your head with all kinds of complicated ways of talking about things. So maybe a simple example of this is, and you've seen this, and there's a way in which this bleeds into a different problem, where people get too legalistic or too precise or too exact about things. Where, let's suppose, for example, that I drive a small pickup truck to work. I do not have a small pickup truck, but maybe someday I'll have enough money to buy a small pickup truck that I desperately need, by the way. And you say, oh, I drove my car to work. And people are like, oh, you don't own a car. You own a truck. It's like, well, yeah, okay, whatever. Right? And people do this all the time. Like, I've done this to people too. So people do it all the time. And the reason why is because they want to seem like they have something to contribute. Right? And also to kind of knock you down, like, well, you don't really drive a car to work, right? But there's lots of ways to describe what a truck is. Like a truck, and calling a truck a car when you're using it to get from point A to point B seems perfectly reasonable to me. It's not wrong. It's not precise, maybe, sure, but most of our language is imprecise anyway without us realizing it. And when you do that, you're knocking somebody down, because you could just as easily say it's a vehicle, because it is. It's also a vehicle. So a truck is a vehicle, and it's a truck. And then you have the truck purists, and fair enough to them. They're like, oh, small trucks aren't trucks. It needs to be able to carry so many tons, or tow so many whatevers, or have an 8-cylinder motor in it, or whatever the heck it is. There's all kinds of purity standards that people apply to these things, and maybe they should, right? But not in all cases. And so people tend to complicate things deliberately so that either they seem smarter, or they take over the conversation, or they involve themselves inappropriately in a discussion with you or with somebody else. And you see this all the time. And another way that people do this is they'll add extra facts about something that sort of aren't within the realm of what you're discussing in the moment. So if you're on a topic and say you're talking about your cell phone, and you're like, oh, my cell phone has this new app on it, and the app allows me to scan with the camera at the room, and it shows me where the constellations and stars are, which I do have an app for that, by the way. It's awesome. And then somebody's like, oh yeah, well, those new cell phone apps, there's all kinds of new augmented reality features, for games. I was like, well, yeah, but I was like talking about astronomy and how cool the app was on my phone. We weren't really discussing you and your expertise on gaming and augmented reality necessarily, even though that's an augmented reality app. Sure, kind of. It's more like a highlighting reality, but it is augmenting reality too. They're honing in on the conversation to sound smart or to be smart, and smart people often get caught up in this. But that also leaves, when you're trying to be smart about something, and anybody can get caught in this trap. When you're trying to be smart about something, you can get overly complicated about things, right? You can get really, really caught up in the enchantment of big words and really difficult solutions that really need some grappling, when there are much simpler solutions available. And one example of this is, to some extent I hate to bring it up, but Eric Weinstein talked a number of years ago, I think it was 2009, on YouTube. You can find it, I think, still on YouTube. I saw this years back. He was talking about the financial crisis and how, had they listened to physicists and mathematicians, the 2008 financial crisis never would have happened. Now, unfortunately, I'm a victim of the crisis. I went to court for 5 years about this. I did a ton of research. As anybody who actually knows me really well, who's known me for years, knows, I research. And I research really well compared to the average researcher at a college. I'm pretty thorough. I'll read white papers. I've read thousands of white papers. I have no problem with most of that language, and I look stuff up, and I'll spend whatever hours it takes. I won't read a long book, but I'll read books worth of white papers, no problem. I went through a legal case. I went through actual case law on this. I know a lot about what happened in the housing crisis. It wasn't difficult. It wasn't complicated. I'm not saying there weren't tranches and second order derivatives and crazy things like that. There were. That was 1% of the market, though. You can look that up. I'm sure you'll find the data. And if you don't, you can do the numbers yourself, because it's just tranches and all that nonsense that they were selling you on is an overly complicated explanation for what happened. What happens, very simple. People committed fraud. Basic fraud. They just lied about what they owned. That's it. And nobody could trace it, right? Nobody could trace it because the registered owners of the properties, the only central registry there is, are the counties in which your mortgage is registered, were the mortgage servicers. And they were not, because they separated the mortgage and the actual note from one another, that was not reflecting who owned anything. And so what happened is the same thing that happened in the savings and loan scandal in the 80s. So you can look up the savings and loan scandal. Countrywide, the company that was Countrywide Mortgage, was also in the savings and loan scandal and got bailed out, and then changed counties and pulled the same scam again. The other thing you can do is you can look up Taylor, Bean and Whitaker on Wikipedia and look at the dates of when they got caught doing what they were doing, and look at what they were doing and what they got away with as an audited company. That was what every mortgage company was doing. Taylor, Bean and Whitaker made up physical addresses and houses that never existed and sold mortgages on them. Made them up. Did not exist. That's the whole 2008 housing crisis, the whole thing. Everybody thought everybody owned things that they didn't own. In many cases, in my case in particular, 4 different banks claimed to own my house at different times. 4 banks, not loan servicers. Loan servicers stayed the same. 4 different banks tried to foreclose on my house. Okay, obviously 4 banks did not own my house. They weren't foreclosing on a part. They weren't claiming they owned 25% or 20% or 10% or 2% or 1%. They claimed they owned the whole thing, because that's usually how that's done, by the way. Like I said, tranches, 1%. They don't usually slice up mortgage paper. That was common practice. And it's not relevant, because if you own a slice of it, you own none of it legally. Sorry, just how it works. You can't, by slicing the mortgage up, you abrogate the contract, actually. Contract law, basic contract law, by the way. So there's no way that happened the way it happened. So for somebody like Eric Weinstein, who did no research on this at all, because anybody who did any research realizes that this is what was going on, to sit there and say, oh, us smart people would have been able to solve this for you, is bullshit. It's wrong. It's a lie. It's a lie. And I say it's a lie because he could have done his research. There was a guy in Kentucky when I was doing my research, which I think it was in 2011 or 2012. It might have been earlier than that, but it was somewhere in that range. His house was foreclosed on and he paid cash for it. There was no mortgage on his house in his name. And his house actually got foreclosed on, or I think that lawsuit lasted 3 years. 3 years to resolve 10 minutes of paperwork. Oh, look, I paid cash. There's no mortgage. 3 years in courts. The courts are screwed up. We need to fix that. There is no justice in the United States. There wasn't back then, and it hasn't changed. It's gotten worse, if anything. But smart people like Eric Weinstein would have you believe that this is a complicated problem that only somebody with a big brain like his could solve. It's nonsense. The whole thing's a lie. It's a lie. And that's the problem. They don't like simple problems. Who wants to hear this message? You, me, and everybody else was fooled by basic fraud. People just put things on pieces of paper and said that they were true. That's all that happened. And the people that put them on paper knew they weren't true. And this is the best part. Long before I went to court, 60 Minutes did a whole piece on, there was a company, I forget which state it was in, that was falsifying signatures on mortgage paperwork. For the banks, they didn't cover the falsified signatures of the individuals, which they also did. And I know this because they did it to a friend of mine. I saw the evidence myself. And he called them up and said, I know this is a forged signature because my wife and I signed all of the paperwork together. And this only has my signature on it. So he had proof positive that it was forged. It's a forged document. They were forging documents all over the place. Simple forgery on a mass scale, on a corporate scale, known, reported in the news. Courts still wouldn't rule against the banks, even though they knew or could have known that the banks were lying about what they owned. And it's that simple. And nobody wants to hear that message. Nobody wants to know that there's a simple problem like that with a simple solution called, all the fraudsters lose. That's all that had to happen. Nobody wants to know that. And I don't blame you. I don't blame anybody. I didn't want to hear it. I spent 5 years in court. I should have given up and not spent all the money. I could have saved myself a lot of money. It costs a lot of money to stay in court for 5 years. But that's the problem. We don't want to believe that something so simple could fool us. Who wants to believe that? Who wants to believe the world is full of fraud at that level that no one is catching, even though it's clearly against the rules, and we all agree that it's against the rules, and we all know it's wrong. And nobody wants to believe that because we want to believe that we're smarter than we are, or that we're more attentive than we are, or that the systems that we have in place to protect us from these things are working when in fact they're not. And so I understand the sentiment, but you can see this a lot. You see this when people do a lot of sort of talking around words. So you can take a very simple concept, like purpose in life or meaning in life, and you can start putting crazy words around it, right? You can add Greek terms like telos, and you can start talking about, there's reasons why you do things, but that's not the purpose of what you do. And then you have goals, and these are all talking about the same thing, even though they're not the same words, and they have different definitions for a reason. But it's very easy because words bleed into one another, right? In many cases, and you can alter the meanings of words, right? And I have a video on words and meaning. If you're confused about what that is and why that's important to understand, the meanings can be altered. And so you can use a bunch of different words that actually point at the same concept. And people who want to be smart do that all the time. And they'll do things like, so you've got a crisis. Let's just say a crisis might be that there's the mortgage crisis, and then there's a currency crisis, but then there are these meta crises. So see what I did there? I just put another word in front of the word crises to make you think that there's another level or a higher order or like more important crises. And then I can talk about the climate is a meta crisis, right? Because it affects the whole planet. It's like, maybe, but maybe I just did that to sound smart. And the use of the word meta is inappropriate, which it is anyway, because it just means after. That's what it means. So people get caught up in trying to sound smart or trying to make things sound bigger or more complicated than they actually are, because then they have these big complicated solutions, right? So, one solution to the climate is that we, do these complicated programs where we have this carbon swapping between countries, right? Carbon credits, and that will take care of the problem, right? Even though basically any fourth grade idiot can figure out that growing more trees in the Ukraine or wherever does not offset the carbon that goes into the atmosphere as a result of the factory in the United States, okay? That obviously doesn't happen. So why you would set up a complicated system like that if you're like Al Gore or something who got caught with a bunch of emails admitting that it was just a financial scam is beyond me, unless, of course, you wanted to sound smart and steal lots of money, which is basically what happened in that case, and maybe many of the other cases when people start talking about the meta crisis, right? People like to make things sound very complicated. And there was a book, I think it was in Freakonomics actually, where they were talking about some of the solutions, simple and cheap solutions to climate change, or at least to the part of climate change where they're removing greenhouse gases. And I talked to a number of very bright people that I know who are legitimately smart, much smarter than I am, about this, and they all rejected all of it. So no, that book's full of garbage, and that's all nonsense. And I was like, what? What do you mean it's all nonsense? Are you sure it's all nonsense? It sounded pretty reasonable to me, and it was all cheap solutions. I mean, they were all like, I think the most expensive solution was $5 billion. It's like, that's nothing. The global economy is trillions of dollars. $5 billion is like nothing. That's pocket change. And yeah, this was a while ago. $5 billion was a lot more back then, but it still wasn't that much. And they didn't like any of those solutions because they were too simple. That's why they didn't like them. They didn't like them because they were too simple, and they didn't think of them. I'm sure if they had thought of them, they'd thought they were the best ideas ever. And like, look, I respect these people. They're very smart. I know they're very smart, but we're all prone to our ego, and we all fall down this trap where we get into complicated explanations, complicated problems, so that we can come up with complicated solutions, so we can sound smart, or we can use big words to sound smart. Like I do it all the time. People do this. It's not a big deal, but it's good to notice. It's good to look for, to say, all right, why maybe this person's putting together a really good story, and maybe they're really smart. Like, absolutely. Maybe they're super articulate, whatever. And it sounds good because it all hangs together, and they seem confident that they know what they're talking about, and they have the IQ to back this up. You know it. Absolutely. This happens all the time. But maybe they're just coming up with something complicated to feel good about their solution, or to feel good about the fact that they can play at that level, right? And they know they're leaving you behind. And so if you feel left behind, like, how good is an idea that you can't explain to others? Is that idea actually worth anything at that point? And maybe you be fair about it, right? You say, well, some people won't understand it. Yeah, okay. But what if the people that need to implement it, like the people that need to work on it physically and do the thing in the world, can't understand it? Maybe then it's not a good idea, no matter how well it would work otherwise. And that's where we get caught up. And that goes back to my last video, magical thinking, right? Where definitely people are into this magical thinking where it's like, look, if I were in charge, none of this would have happened because I would have seen this coming. It's like, you think with all the information you would have had coming at you while you were in charge, that you would have picked up on this one thing that maybe you never could hear about, because you can't hear about everything. In fact, you can't hear about most things. And you would have thought about it in the right frame at the right time and come up with that particular solution with all the other voices yelling at you about other things or other frames or whatever, right? Because you can always take any problem and frame it more difficultly, right? You can say, well, look, we've got this small skirmish going on with the Kurds. And you can say, but look, it's 400 Kurds, and, what are we going to do for 400 Kurds? All right. Or you can take that same incident and say, look, the Kurds have been fighting for a long time. They're the most stable controllers of the oil fields. I'm not making claims. I'm just sort of spinning stories here just as illustrative examples, although maybe my claims are also accurate. I don't know, but I'm not going to make them. Right? Maybe they're the best people to run the oil fields or to keep them stable and make sure they don't get blown up for various reasons, right? And also, they're a buffer for other countries, stability. Because they're unstable in the middle, they keep the whole region stable. Well, that's a different argument. Now it's not about 400 people anymore. Now it could be about 3 countries or 4 countries or the stability of an entire global region. And then it's like, well, why wouldn't you help 400 people if you could stabilize 4 countries or 2 countries even, or stabilize the lives of tens or hundreds of thousands of people or a few million people, right? So the framing matters, and maybe, maybe that's overcomplicating things, and maybe it's not. So I'm not saying these are easy to tease out, but there's a way in which you can always do that, right? You can always make it about, well, if that region became destabilized, then we'd have more terrorism. And so really it benefits the world if we help the Kurds. Like, there's always ways that if you're in charge, people can frame things for you in a way that makes it sound plausible, whatever proposal solution they have. So complexifying things, right, making things really, really complex or complicated can really change what's salient to you, what you're looking at, what you're aiming for, and what you're willing to do. And that's why people tend to do it, because then they sound smart, or they get to implement their really big solution. And the problem with larger solutions, with more complicated solutions, with wider reaching sort of big brain solutions, is that the larger something is, the more unintended consequences it has. And unintended consequences is a sneaky thing, right? Because really what it's saying is, you don't know the results of your actions no matter how much you understand the world. That's what that means. And that's really important to understand. And that's why you should prefer simple problem formulations and simple solutions. Now, unfortunately, there's a way in which we're fooled by simple solutions. You can always say, homeless people, just buy them homes. But as I've discussed before, that doesn't work, and we know it because it's been tried. It's been tried in this country. It's been tried in whole states. It's been tried in the entire city of New York. It's been tried in other countries. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because the people didn't become homeless for the same reason, and reasons matter. Starting points matter. I'll do a video on that at some point. I'll try to pin it here. So it's not an easy thing to say, oh, we'll just, gin together a simple solution, because a simple solution turns out to be a bunch of complicated, ridiculous sorts of hoops that you have to jump through. And sometimes these things can't be simplified because we're framing them wrong. The homelessness problem is not a homelessness problem. There are a bunch of people that are homeless, but they don't all have the same problem. They did not all get homeless the same way. And so there's a way in which oversimplification is also a problem. And when we're not smart, we prefer oversimplified solutions to complicated ones. Fair enough. But hopefully if we're not smart, we're humble enough to believe that we don't have the answers. And that's really the key to this. Smart people tend to believe that they have answers, or that they could have answers. And they tend to couch their answers as pure good. And you should always watch out for that. If somebody's not telling you what the downside is, maybe they don't know what it is, or maybe they know full well and they don't care, which I would argue is a worse situation, or maybe they haven't thought about it, which is a really dangerous thing. And that's not good. It's probably dangerous when people come up with solutions and you ask them, well, what are the possible side effects? And they don't know. or they insist there aren't any. That's a good way to know. And also, it's good when people are using big words to kind of find out when you say that, is there a simpler way to say it, right? And sometimes you can do that on your own. Sometimes you have to ask them and see if they can make it more accessible, easier to understand. Because if you can't make something easy to understand, and like I'm guilty of this all the time, we all are to some extent, because we only have our own perspective, then maybe it's just too complicated, and you've made it too complicated on purpose, because you haven't thought about it enough, right? If you don't have enough perspectives on the idea in your head that you can simplify it, then maybe you don't have enough perspectives. And that's true for other people. If they don't have enough perspectives that they can talk about it in different ways to different audiences, then they probably haven't given it enough thought. And so that's one thing that you can use, on yourself. Do I have enough perspectives to make this understandable to somebody simpler, right? Somebody with a simpler vocabulary or simpler formulations. Does somebody else? Because maybe they just haven't thought about it enough. And so the fact that they're, quote, really smart doesn't help. And that's what we want to avoid, right? We want to avoid listening to people who aren't even necessarily wrong. I'm not saying they're wrong, but maybe their intelligence is getting in their way of coming up with an answer that you can implement reasonably in the world, or coming up with an answer that will work at all, even though it sounds like it'll work. Because again, we do engage in that magical thinking, and everything works in your head. It's when it hits the ground that things start to fail. So that's what we have to watch out for. And it's a tricky problem, as I pointed out. There's two sides to that for sure, like there are with most things. And I'm not trying to make it easy, so I apologize if it's not easy, but life's not easy. But maybe we can have a little bit of humility, both for ourselves and maybe extend ourselves and others some grace, because we're all prone to these problems, because they're deep problems of the ego. We want to be smart. Being smart, getting points for being smart means solving complicated problems, not simple ones, in some cases. And feeling smart is certainly all about that. And people want to feel smart. And if they can convince you that they're right, even if they may suspect that, or may know flat out that you didn't understand a word they said, they'll usually settle for that because your ego is sneaky. And I'm not saying they're doing it maliciously, but your ego is a sneaky little puppy, and it'll do things like that to you. And that's why rocketing to fame is a problem, right? Because that's what it does. You start to hear a lot of positive feedback, right, and a lot of praise, and you don't hear a lot of, well, you could have done this better, you could have done that better, and that's, people are afraid of that, and maybe they should be, but usually the people that are afraid of that aren't prone to it anyway. And there's an easy way around that. You get a disagreeable person like me, and I'll just always tell you the truth because I just don't care. I do care about the truth, but I just care less about you than I do about the truth. Sorry about that. There are solutions, but we do always have to keep in mind that we're small creatures in a large world that we cannot understand. We don't have the capacity to, and neither can anyone else. And to the extent that one person can maybe understand everything about the cell phone, I can't even understand everything about the damn cell phone. It's my field, roughly speaking, computers. That doesn't mean that their solutions are good ones. It doesn't mean that their complicated ways of understanding are good ways to understand, because you can always understand things in a complicated fashion, no matter how simple they are, and you want to, or at least part of you does. And that part of you is something you have to fight against internally yourself. And you have to help other people fight against it themselves, just by asking them simple questions. That usually works. And when it doesn't work, they're up to something. Maybe they don't know they're up to something, and that's fair. But at least you can avoid putting too much stock in them and putting more stock in your own senses. Because if you listen to your own senses clearly, you'll get better answers for yourself. And that's really important. We don't want to have to rely on other people for everything, especially not for better answers. So hopefully this gives you a sense for what I'm talking about with complication and smart people and our egos wanting us to be smart and getting cred, getting that support, making things complicated on purpose or complexifying things on purpose just to sort of feel good about what we can do mentally instead of what we can do, say, in the real world physically. Hopefully that'll help you to focus in on that and notice it as a problem and give it some time and attention, which as always is the thing I'm the most grateful for when you're watching my videos, because I really do believe and try to act as if that is the thing that sort of where our collective energies can be focused, right, is on time. Our time and attention focuses that to make the world a better place. And we can't do that unless we're not falling prey to some of these traps. And so I'm always very grateful for your time and attention, because I believe that it gives me and you and everybody else, whether they watch the videos or not, better insight into what's going on and how to do better in the world. And that, I think, is the key to making the world a better place, is if we can all focus on how to be better. Thank you.